Since time immemorial, humanity has remembered cataclysmic events, sweeping floods that erased the old world and paved the way for a new dawn. Across continents and millennia, these supernatural deluges have been etched into our collective mythos, stories passed down that blur the lines between myth and history. Today, we journey into the antediluvian age, the age before the flood, when lost civilizations whispered secrets of renewal and divine judgment. Let's explore 12 iconic flood legends that shaped nations and set the stage for our civilizations. Each account, whether carved in Sumerian clay or passed orally through African deserts, speaks of a time when water ruled supreme. 1. The Sumerian flood, Atrahasis. In ancient Sumer, the Elohim unleashed a devastating deluge to curb human overpopulation. Atrahasis builds a boat to survive, marking the end of the antediluvian era. 2. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim's journey. Long before written history, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim. Warned by the divine, he constructs a vessel to withstand a flood of epic proportions, echoes that resonate through the ages. 3. The biblical deluge, Noah's Ark. Perhaps the most renowned story, Noah, a man of unwavering faith, is chosen to build an ark to save life itself from a world drowned in sin and destruction. 4. The Hindu deluge, Manu and In Hindu tradition, Manu is forewarned by the fish incarnation about an impending deluge. This myth recounts not only survival, but the rebirth of humanity. 5. The Greek flood, Deucalion and Pyrrha. When wrath visited the earth, only Deucalion and Pyrrha survived. By building a rudimentary vessel, their story signifies rebirth through divine intervention. 6. The Chinese deluge, Yu the Great. Legend says ancient China was swept by chaos and destruction until Yu the Great emerged. Through ingenious flood control, dredging rivers, building canals, he tamed the waters, laying the foundation of civilization. 7. Native American flood legends. Across North America, Ojibwe, Hopi, and countless tribes tell of great floods, washing away the old and heralding new beginnings for their peoples. 8. Mesoamerican myths. The Maya and the Popol Vuh. In the Popol Vuh, the Maya recount a flood that eradicated an earlier, imperfect creation, emphasizing life's cyclical renewal. 9. Polynesian inundations. Even in remote Pacific Isles, legends speak of deluges submerging entire lands. Tales where natural disaster meets the supernatural. 10. Incan flood narratives. High in the Andes, Incan myths recall a primordial flood, a divine event that swept away the antediluvian world, setting the stage for a new orderly civilization. 11. Egyptian reflections. Ancient Egypt celebrated the Nile's annual floods as life-giving, but some obscure myths hint at a cataclysmic deluge. One such lesser-known myth involves the fierce Elohim. According to the legend, in his wrath, unleashed to punish a wayward humanity, unleashing her fierce lioness-like fury in a campaign of near-total annihilation. As her rampage threatened to wipe out humankind, the Elohim intervened by overturning vast jugs of fermented wine, creating a symbolic deluge designed to intoxicate and subdue her destructive rage. 12. African oral traditions. Throughout Africa, Yoruba, Mandinka, and others preserve flood legends in oral histories, narratives of divine retribution, cleansing, and society's rebirth. These 12 legends reveal more than catastrophe. They embody the struggle between chaos and order. History itself has a language, a term for lost civilizations, antediluvian. In each story, the flood is not just an ending, but a beginning, a cosmic reset for humanity to rise anew. Join us next as we delve deeper, comparing Sumerian deluges with their biblical counterparts. Which account holds the original truth? The answer lies in the source code of Near Eastern theology. Contemporary scholarship tentatively identifies Mount Nisir with the modern Pio Mar Gudrun, a peak near Sulaymaniyah in Iraqi Kurdistan. Although ancient texts provide remarkably detailed directions, pinpointing its exact location remains an open question. The ambiguity of the Sumerian term Kur, capable of meaning either hill or mountain, adds yet another layer of mystery to this ancient narrative. Now shifting from Mesopotamian myth to historical testimony. Antiquities of the Jews recounts that Noah's Ark was not merely legend, but a site of pilgrimage. According to Josephus, believers journeyed to Mount Judy, where the ark was said to have come to rest. Pilgrims venerated remnants of the wooden superstructure as sacred relics, a living testimony to a divine act of salvation. At first glance, Mount Nisir and Mount Judy might seem to echo each other. However, they arise from entirely distinct traditions. Mount Nisir belongs to the Mesopotamian mythic framework, where a divinely ordained ark finds refuge atop a mountain. Mount Judy, by contrast, is rooted in Hebrew scripture and became central to Jewish and later Islamic pilgrimage. The Hebrew scriptures speak of the mountains of Ararat, a term indicating not just a single peak, but a broad, majestic highland. When stripped of later traditions that later fixed the narrative on one specific mountain, the text allows us to interpret this region more expansively. Here, Mount Judy emerges as a compelling candidate. Although traditional Judeo-Christian interpretations often champion Mount Ararat proper as the ark's landing site, a close reading suggests that the broader range might well include Mount Judy. Josephus's testimony of pilgrimages to this region lends further credence to the scriptural account. Even in his day, the faithful revered this landscape, marking it as an enduring testament to the ark's presence. The final destruction of the ark may have even spurred a shift in local memory, prompting a transformation of tradition, away from a physical relic toward an ongoing sacred landscape marked by pilgrimage. Thus, by focusing on the scripture itself, we find that Mount Judy, situated near the expansive Ararat highlands, harmonizes beautifully with the original narrative, a bridge from the ancient Ubaid legacy through the water apocalypse to the burgeoning civilization that built monuments like the Tower of Babel. In the end, these mountains tell separate yet intertwined stories of a great deluge, stories that have shaped human belief across millennia. Josephus's testimony of pilgrimages and relics at Mount Judy reinforces a historicity once embraced by eyewitnesses and sacred tradition. Meanwhile, the Sumerian myth, immortalized in the Epic of Gilgamesh, offers an independent glimpse into a world remade by catastrophe and renewal. Genesis gives us a precise date for Noah's flood, year 1656 Anno Mundi, or about 2348 BC. Geologists find global markers: polystrate tree trunks piercing multiple layers, marine fossils atop mountain strata, rapid turbidites, signs of one swift, catastrophic deluge. By contrast, Sumer's flood tales, Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, only appear in tablets from 2100 to 1700 BC, centuries after any recorded cataclysm. That tight biblical date, plus real-world strata, make Genesis far more anchored in history than borrowed Mesopotamian myths. There's a strong case to be made when you line up the biblical narrative with historical, archaeological, and linguistic data. Consider, for example, the biblical account of the flood, where detailed blueprints for Noah's Ark are supported by eyewitness descriptions, and modern reconstructions, like Ken Ham's replica, lend credibility to the idea that the Ark isn't merely myth, but a pivotal element in early civilization's history. Moving on. After the deluge's waters recede, human civilization doesn't start from a barren void. Instead, evidence from the Ubaid culture, with its sophisticated settlements, advanced pottery making, and early irrigation, reveals a people ready to reconstruct their world. In these ancient traces, we find a quiet continuity of craft and community, that sets the stage for new beginnings. Their skilled hands, having honed techniques before the flood, now work to restore order from chaos, etching the blueprint for the new age. The development of post-flood civilizations finds a fascinating anchor in the story of the Tower of Babel. Greek historian Herodotus recorded seeing a tower in Babylon. The tower restored by Nebuchadnezzar and marked with his own inscriptions. These marks survive today on an artifact known as the Tower of Babel stele, alongside Hebrew sources. This evidence suggests that the Tower of Babel was not just a fable, but a real monumental structure. The Genesis narrative tells us that divine intervention halted the construction of this tower by scrambling the languages of its builders, scattering them across the earth. While Herodotus never names the tower as Babel or explicitly connects it with the Genesis account, his detailed description of Babylon's temple complex aligns remarkably well with what we now identify as Etemenanke, the ziggurat, whose very name means house of the foundation of heaven on earth. In Histories 1.181, Herodotus describes a massive, stepped tower in Babylon, boasting 8 levels with a temple at the top, a description that mirrors the known structure of Etemenanke. The Tower of Babel stele, bearing inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar II, confirms that this ziggurat was restored under his reign, even when it lay in ruins. Here, the physical description echoes the Genesis account, a monumental tower built on the plain of Shinar, abandoned mid-construction, and forever altered by divine intervention. From a linguistic standpoint, an even more intriguing and shocking piece of the puzzle emerges. Although the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians all used the same cuneiform writing system and shared overlapping religious practices laden with many of the same Elohim, the Sumerian language stands apart as a language isolate with no known relatives. Even more surprising is that the Semitic languages of the Akkadians and Babylonians are not derived from Sumerian, despite these commonalities in script and religious symbolism. This discrepancy is striking, especially considering these peoples were otherwise part of a close cultural lineage. Viewed through a biblical lens, this confusion of tongues is not a modern fabrication, but is supported by the stark divisions evident in the written records. Indeed, it underscores how a supernatural scrambling of language, as described in the Tower of Babel narrative, could have fundamentally altered the course of civilization, halting or redirecting a grand construction project. In summary, when we layer historical testimonials from figures like Herodotus and the monumental inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar with modern linguistic evidence, the biblical account of divine intervention transforms from a mere story into a compelling hypothesis. This intersection of faith and empirical inquiry challenges us to reconsider the true capabilities and historical impact of ancient civilizations. It's a reminder that the mysteries of the past are often hidden in plain sight, in the artifacts, the languages, and the enduring ancient texts that still speak to us today. Herodotus, in his Histories, gave us a glimpse into a world where reality and divine intervention intersected. According to Herodotus, this tower was not a mere architectural feat. It was a symbol of humanity's ambition. The biblical story tells us that as the people built this tower, their language was miraculously scrambled, causing them to scatter. Inscribed on the very bricks of the tower were declarations of abandonment, a clear echo of the Tower of Babel described in Scripture. But Herodotus's account goes even deeper. He paints a vivid picture of a society where the less fortunate, those too poor to afford proper care, were left to languish in the streets. In such a society, only those who could afford a temple magician or physician received care, while the poor relied on communal wisdom. This wasn't just a tale of architectural wonder. It was a snapshot of the harsh realities of class and the desperate reliance on ritualistic medicine. Turning now to the controversial sphere of ancient religious practices, We examine the claims of the Greek historian Herodotus. In Histories 1.199, Herodotus describes sacred prostitution in Babylon he compares to customs in Cyprus. According to his account, every Babylonian woman was once required to sit in the temple of engaging in ritual intercourse with a stranger as an act of religious devotion. Cyprus wasn't a part of Phoenicia in a strict political sense, but its ties to the Phoenician world were profound. As early as the 2nd millennium BC, Phoenician city-states, like Tyre and Sidon, established colonies and trading posts along the Cypriot coast. One notable city, Kition, emerged as a major Phoenician hub, fueling a relationship defined by trade, cultural exchange, and shared maritime interests. During the Achaemenid Persian Empire, when both Cyprus and Phoenicia fell under the 5th satrapy, their destinies remained intertwined. Think of Cyprus not as a Phoenician province, but as a close neighbor, its culture and commerce deeply enriched by Phoenician influence. Herodotus's description is supported by what we know of Phoenician religious practices in cities like Byblos and Sidon, where ritual sex acts were reportedly performed in honor of deities like the Phoenician counterpart to. While some modern scholars argue that Herodotus may have misunderstood or even exaggerated these rites, colored by Greek perceptions of an exotic East, there is evidence suggesting that actual temple-based rites, later suppressed or transformed into symbolic rituals, did take place. Moreover, a similar practice is hinted at in the Hebrew Scriptures. In several biblical texts, such as Deuteronomy 23.17, we encounter the term Kaddish, a consecrated person, often linked to ritual prostitution in licentious idolatry. These passages serve as pointed critiques of Canaanite and Phoenician practices, echoing the ritual sexual rites described by Herodotus. They reveal a complex cultural pattern in which religion, sexuality, and economics intersected. By weaving together these varied sources, the accounts of Herodotus, the critical verses of Hebrew Scripture, and archaeological evidence, we paint a portrait of a world where economic class, religious devotion, and ritual practices were inextricably linked. Some modern critics attempt to dismiss these accounts, yet the biblical narrative itself corroborates the existence of sacred prostitution long before Herodotus put pen to paper. Some modern critics attempt to dismiss Herodotus's accounts as exaggerations or misinterpretations of exotic rites. However, this dismissal often overlooks the rich historical and social tapestry of ancient Babylon. Far from being isolated anecdotes, his descriptions harmonize with corroborative archaeological records and biblical narratives. When we consider evidence from consistent imagery of sacred rituals, it becomes clear that Herodotus was observing a profound, if complex, reality. A reality where divine intervention and ritual prostitution were woven into the very fabric of society. To dismiss Herodotus's work without engaging with this broader context is to disconnect from history itself. His careful chronicling of practices, such as the sacred prostitution tied to fertility cults and the stark realities of the sick left to suffer on the streets, reveals insights into the social stratification and institutional dynamics of the era. Critics who ignore these facets miss the intricate balance between religious practice, economic hardship, and societal resilience that defined ancient Babylon. Today, we explore a startling narrative shift that laid the foundation for the Abrahamic faiths. In Sumeria, the deity El did not belong to the local pantheon. Yet, Abraham, later revered as the father of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, emerged from the Sumerian city-state of a place where El was not traditionally worshipped. Guided by a holy calling, Abraham set out on a pilgrimage directed by El, the creator of the world, who is the singular object of worship in all three Abrahamic religions. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the names El, Elohim, and Adonai are used interchangeably, grounding the divine identity in a deep linguistic and covenantal tradition. Long before Abraham, Noah worshipped only El, and his remarkable story, anchored by the reality of Noah's Ark, served as the source code for a monotheistic faith that preceded and profoundly influenced all that followed. Although Noah's descendants rebuilt civilization, beginning with Sumeria, they did so at the expense of losing much of the original heritage of Noah's faith. This biblical record stands in sharp contrast to the later polytheistic systems of the ancient Near East. The pantheons of Sumeria, Canaan, and Phoenicia were more akin to one another, characterized by a fragmented and anthropomorphic view of the divine, than to the pure, monotheistic tradition handed down from Noah. The Bible, which reliably chronicles major events such as Noah's Ark and the Tower of Babel, presents a detailed account of Noah's religion, a faith that was distinctly different from the Canaanite system that emerged in the post-deluge world. Tracing Abraham's departure from a Sumerian society steeped in polytheism to the renewed worship of El reveals that he was not the originator of monotheism, but rather its revivalist, a returning steward reclaiming the ancient faith once held by Noah and later obscured amidst the sprawling empires of the post-flood era. The Hebrew narrative tells a story of divine continuity, moral purpose, and monotheistic coherence stretching back to Adam, Noah, and Abraham. In contrast, the myths of the Canaanite tradition, though richly symbolic, reflect a competitive and often morally ambiguous view of the divine. By mapping these fault lines between revelation and invention, between inherited wisdom and cultural reinterpretation, we highlight a clear, powerful contrast. Noah's monotheistic worship, in which one divine name, El, survived as a cultural fossil amid a sea of polytheistic reformations, stands apart from the later, diverse religious systems that emerged in the ancient Near East. This contrast not only underscores the distinctiveness of Noah's faith, but also sets the stage for understanding how the worship of El continued to shape the theological landscape of the Abrahamic traditions. Today we explore a critical turning point in the ancient Near Eastern religious landscape, a moment when the divine identity of El began to divide paths. Abraham was called to worship El in a way that distinctly set him apart from the Canaanites, even though they, too, used the name El. Yet, the promise was clear. El would give the land of the Canaanites to Abraham and his lineage, thereby disqualifying the Canaanite version of El from the true heritage. The religion of the Canaanites was so starkly different from the faith later embodied by Moses that without the unifying name El, the Canaanite religion would be completely unrecognizable as the Hebrew faith. The Hebrew scriptures repeatedly warn the Israelites, "Avoid the customs of the Canaanites. Do not intermarry." These admonitions aren't just about ethnic boundaries. They're about preserving theological purity in a world where the same word, El, masks vastly different belief systems. In effect, Elohim was saying, do not be deceived by linguistic familiarity. These are not your people, and this is not your Elohim. The Canaanite use of El had become divorced from the primordial truth passed down from Adam and Noah, a syncretized shell of Elohim, with similar names, but alien attributes, folded into a polytheistic pantheon that bore no resemblance to the covenantal relationship Elohim intended. By emphasizing the continuity of El's worship, we trace a direct line from the antediluvian past into the evolving theological landscapes of the ancient Near East, a line that stands in deliberate contrast to the fragmented polytheism of the Canaanites. Moreover, the scriptures are clear. Adam was in direct contact with Elohim, and by the third generation, men began to call on the name Adonai. By the fifth generation, they added El to their names as a mark of honor. This progression frames the biblical narrative not as insular or reactionary, but as a protective act, a fierce guarding of a fragile thread of inherited truth amidst rampant spiritual entropy. In the end, this isn't merely a geopolitical conflict. It's a cosmological battle of origin stories and divine identities. Abraham's calling, and the resolute warnings to avoid Canaanite ways, underscore a deliberate effort to preserve a clear, monotheistic heritage. Though the word El appears in many traditions, its true, covenantal sense, worshipped first by Adam, reinforced by Noah, and revived by Abraham, signified a people set apart. No known Canaanite flood myth, or any account resembling the Tower of Babel story, has surfaced in the extant Ugaritic or broader Canaanite texts. While Mesopotamian cultures like the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians preserved detailed flood narratives, most famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and maintained memories of monumental tower building as symbols of human aspiration, the Canaanite mythological corpus, as recovered from Ras Shamra, Ugarit, is notably silent on any comparable deluge or tower tradition. This absence is striking, especially given how widespread flood myths are across ancient cultures. It strengthens the thesis that the biblical flood account stands apart, rooted in a distinct theological lineage that traces back to Noah and the singular worship of El, unshared by the polytheistic systems of Canaan. In short, no flood myth or tower narrative exists in Canaanite lore. That's not just a slam dunk, it's a full-court buzzer beater for the argument. It sets the detailed story of Noah's Ark as preceding Canaanite mythology, with the only vestige remaining of Noah's faith in the Canaanite lineage being the name El. The absence of a Canaanite flood myth, and the lack of any Tower of Babel story, isn't merely silence, it's a loud echo of what was lost. What remains? A single divine name, El, floating in the midst of a vastly transformed religious sea. It's like a cultural fossil, a linguistic artifact that survived while the original meaning and monotheistic reverence behind it were buried under layers of mythology and ritual. By anchoring the biblical flood as earlier and more cohesive, Noah's story is positioned as the source code of Near Eastern theology, while Canaanite mythologies become the distorted, polytheistic derivatives. It's a clean, powerful contrast. Noah with one Elohim and one ark, versus Canaan with 70 Elohim and no boat. This focused contrast between the faith of Noah's line, as reflected in Genesis, and the Canaanite religion shows just how distinct they are, and why no true flood deluge, nor a Tower of Babel narrative, survives in Canaanite myth outside a vague sea Elohim threat. Today, we delve into a striking contrast, a battle of divine identities in the ancient Near East that pits a strict monotheism against a multifaceted polytheism. This isn't just a discussion of belief systems. It's a confrontation between a covenant that protects life and a mosaic of deities whose rites often embraced moral ambiguity. Noah's religion was strictly monotheistic. He worshipped one creator, Elohim, who entered into a sacred covenant with humanity, first with Noah, as detailed in Genesis, and later through figures such as Abraham and Moses. This covenant wasn't arbitrary. For instance, Genesis 9:6 tells us, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of Elohim made he man." In this system, worship is obedience-based, centered on the protection of life. In stark contrast, the Canaanites embraced a complex pantheon. They honored El, the father of years, alongside Elohim like the storm and fertility Elohim, the Elohim of grain, and many other lesser divine beings. Yet, despite sharing the name El with the Hebrews, the Canaanite conception of this deity diverged dramatically. Their religion was predominantly oriented around seasonal fertility rites, ritual sexuality, and even child sacrifice in exchange for agricultural abundance, practices that lacked any universal moral code. An equally significant disparity lies in how both traditions understand divine intervention. The Genesis account describes a global flood, a reset for humanity, while Canaanite texts, such as the Ugaritic Baal cycle, feature a tempestuous sea, Elohim, who threatens and demands tribute but never drowns all of humanity. Moreover, there is no account of a Tower of Babel in the Canaanite pantheon. Canaanite myth focuses on the chaotic interplay among their myriad Elohim rather than on an all-encompassing divine reset. This comparison drives home a powerful point. Israel's ancestral faith was in radical opposition to the surrounding Canaanite worldview. The biblical tradition, rooted in the covenant with Noah, emphasizes that life is sacred and that worship must follow divine moral law. In the Hebrew Bible, names like El, Elohim, and Adonai become synonymous markers of a life-protecting, covenant-honoring Elohim. Meanwhile, in Canaanite mythology, the same name masks a very different reality. A collection of Elohim, who, in many instances, permitted or even endorsed practices such as child sacrifice. The biblical writers were keenly aware of these differences. They repeatedly warn the Israelites, do not intermarry with the Canaanites, do not adopt their customs, not merely to preserve ethnic boundaries, but to safeguard theological purity. When Elohim commands do not intermarry with them, do not adopt their customs, it is a directive to maintain a clear and uncompromised identity. The Canaanite altars, where infants were sometimes sacrificed, stand in stark opposition to the altars of Noah, where every human life is deemed precious. Here, one life and death issue, murder versus the horrific act of child sacrifice, captures the essence of this rift. Israel's Elohim is not just another Near Eastern deity. He is antithetical to the moral chaos and ritualistic brutality that marked Canaanite worship. The Genesis covenant, with its promise of a rainbow and a lamb dedicated to the faithful, sets Israel's tradition apart. There is no child sacrifice exception clause in that covenant, no compromise with the darker practices of its neighbors. When we examine these differences, the strict monotheism versus a fragmented polytheism, the clear moral law versus fertility rites, and the absence in Canaanite myth of narratives like a global flood or a Tower of Babel, we uncover more than historical contrasts. We discover a profound cosmological battle, a fight for the soul of humanity that begins with the earliest commandments and carries on through every generation. As we continue to peel back the layers of these narratives, we see that the heritage of Israel was never merely a regional variation. It was a radical, protective stand for life, justice, and divine truth. As we trace Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel, and Abraham's pilgrimage, one truth stands out. The Bible doesn't merely echo other legends, it transcends them. Noah's Ark resonates in global flood memories, yet only Genesis delivers precise blueprints, living pilgrim traditions, and geological markers in perfect harmony. The Tower of Babel. Other cultures built ziggurats, but only the Hebrew narrative recounts a divine scrambling of tongues, a detail echoed in archaeology and in linguistics, yet unmatched elsewhere. Abraham's calling in Ur wasn't invention, it was revival, a restoration of Noah's monotheism lost amid polytheism. No rival text claims such direct continuity. Time and again, unique, historically attested events, eyewitness testimony, and archaeological echoes affirm the Bible's singular authority. In a world of borrowed myths, the Bible reigns supreme, faith in fact entwined in a covenant that still speaks today.